There can be but one emperor, one God, one savior, one deliverer. Without him, a billion souls are not but fodder for the ever-thirsting evils of the warp.
The Adeptus Ministorum, more commonly known as the Ecclesiarchy, is the official state church of the Imperium of Man, which maintains and promotes the worship of the Emperor of Mankind as the one true God of humanity. It is a massive organization that guides the worship of trillions of people on numberless worlds and across great divides of distance, language, and culture. The core of the Ecclesiarchy's spiritual and temporal power is the cult Imperialis, also known variously as the Imperial Creed or Imperial Cult. The foundation of the cult Imperialis is the belief in and worship of the Emperor as a divine being, the power of the Emperor to intercede in matters spiritual and temporal, the power of prayer to bring about a change in mortal circumstances through the intercession of the Emperor, and the divine right of mankind to rule the stars. The Adeptus Ministorum also administers and spreads the imperial cult throughout the territory of the Imperium. Though any imperial religious cult or sect must ultimately adhere to the core theology of the Imperial Creed, the possibility for conflicting interpretation means that in practice, the cult Imperialis is an agglomeration of many differing schools of theological thought. Whilst agreeing in essence, cults and sects across the galaxy often differ on particular tenets of belief or modes of worship. To many, the Emperor is a god of war, to others a savior and bringer of light, and to some a stern judge of the dead. Inevitably, simple differences of emphasis of faith can become points of hostility and even the cause of bloodshed. Many merciless and savage wars have resulted time and again over such fine points of theological doctrine. Although the interpretation of particular dogmas of the Imperial Creed varies across the many worlds of the Imperium, any extreme deviance from its strictures and theology is considered heresy and dealt with great severity by the Ecclesiarchy, or in extreme cases, the Ordo Hereticus of the Imperial Inquisition. The cult Mechanicus, whilst actually a very different religion from the imperial cult, is tolerated by the Ecclesiarchy under the terms of the ancient Treaty of Mars, which allowed the tech priests of the Red Planet to maintain their faith in the face of the atheistic imperial truth. After the Imperium was transformed into essentially a theocracy in the early 32nd millennium, the Adeptus Mechanicus agreed to a theological compromise with the Ecclesiarchy, which saw the Emperor officially as the omniscient or physical embodiment of their machine god. However, rampant distrust between the adherents of both imperial faiths continues to simmer just beneath the surface, and the Ecclesiarchy and the Mechanicus often view each other as political rivals. The Adeptus Ministorum is based on Holy Terror, its urban ecclesiarchal palace covering nearly all of the southernmost continent of Antarctica. During the Great Crusade, many different religious cults, drawing on the book written by Primarch Lorgar, known as the Lectitio Divinitatis, that first proclaimed that the Emperor of Mankind was actually the incarnate God of humanity, first appeared throughout the Imperium of Man, though each had its own subtle variations and differences in basic theology. These forms of worship appeared first on those primitive planets of the Imperium that had regressed technologically during the long, terror-filled years of the Age of Strife. The number of these cults multiplied exponentially following the Emperor's ultimate sacrifice to save mankind from the rule of the War Master Horus and the Dark Gods at the end of the Horus heresy and his subsequent interment within the Golden Throne. This event was hailed by believers as the Emperor's ascension back to full divinity within the Immaterium. Most of these cults would gradually fade away, while others prospered, eventually absorbing the weaker ones. The more successful cults of emperor worship spread their forms of worship to other planets. The strongest of all the early imperial cults of the Lectitio Divinitatis was called the Temple of the Savior Emperor. This cult had the advantage over the others in that it was based on terror, and that its leader had been a successful and respected officer of the Imperial Army who had fought at the Siege of Terra, defending the heart of the Imperium in its darkest hour. This holy man had renamed himself Fatiticus and had begun to preach his teachings concerning the divinity of the Emperor to anyone who would listen. This faith spread among the members of the reformed Astra Militarum and the Navis Imperialis during the time of rebirth, who had seen at first hand the horrors of chaos, but also to lowly scribes and minor adepts of the Adeptus Terra. The faith was then spread by these individuals to other planets. When Fatiticus died at the age of 120 standard Terran years, the temple had more than 1 billion followers on Terra and untold faithful throughout the Imperium's segmentum solar. In the wake of the chaos and anarchy of the Horus heresy, the Temple of the Savior Emperor provided a message of hope and reunification through a common faith. Cults who rejected being absorbed or who couldn't be absorbed because of wildly different theology saw themselves being persecuted by fanatical mobs who preferred the Savior Emperor's increasingly orthodox belief system. Officially, the temple rejected this violence performed in its name, though in fact it unofficially welcomed the elimination of those rival sects it saw as heretical and threats to its own growing political power. This development culminated in the 32nd millennium, by which time almost 2/3 of the Imperium's population followed the teachings of the Temple of the Savior Emperor, the exceptions being the Adeptus Astartes, as the Space Marines have never formally acknowledged the divinity of the Emperor in a nod to his wishes and the lost Imperial truth, and the Adeptus Mechanicus of Mars, who had their own form of worship in the cult Mechanicus. The temple's importance, influence, and power rapidly outmatched that of any other Lectitio Divinitatis cult dedicated to emperor worship, including its closest rival, the Confederation of Light. In the early 32nd millennium, in recognition of its unprecedented political power over the minds of humanity, the Temple of the Savior Emperor was officially recognized by the High Lords of Terra as the state religion of the Imperium of Man. It also became an official adepta of the Imperium's government as the Adeptus Ministorum, wholly separate from the Adeptus Terra. A few centuries later, the Ecclesiarch Venerus Siscun received a seat on the Senatorum Imperialis and joined the ranks of the High Lords of Terra, and after 300 Terran years, this seat was made permanent. The power of the Ecclesiarchy continued to grow, increasing its hold over the minds and beliefs of the imperial citizenry. Those who wouldn't follow its teachings were declared unbelievers, ostracized, and on occasion even executed. The vast territories of the Imperium were organized into different dioceses led by the Ecclesiarchy's cardinals. These powerful religious and political figures were responsible for the hordes of imperial missionaries and preachers that were released to tend to the spiritual needs of the faithful on hundreds of worlds. Lavish shrines, impressive temples, and majestic cathedrals dedicated to the God Emperor were built throughout the Imperium. Millions of religious pilgrims soon began making their way across the galaxy to visit particularly important religious locations, such as the world where a particular imperial saint had performed their most famous miracle. In time, the sheer number of pilgrims who arrived on certain worlds became an economic activity in and of itself for the Ecclesiarchy, and entire planets were dedicated to worship and directly ruled by the Adeptus Ministorum as so-called shrine worlds. Particularly important shrine worlds might become the religious seat of an entire diocese stretching across a subsector or sector, and so a cardinal would take up residence there. These planets became known as cardinal worlds. The only threat to the Ecclesiarchy's spiritual and political dominance in the Imperium was the Confederation of Light. Based upon the planet Dimamar, this penitent faith's ideals of poverty and humble living clearly contradicted the teachings of the Ecclesiarchy. The orthodox view of the Temple of the Savior Emperor was that sacrifices of wealth and money to the Adeptus Ministorum in taxes, tithes, and other gifts were necessary to enhance the citizens of the Imperium's access to salvation and ensure that the Emperor's light reached every corner of the galaxy through his missions. Politically, the Confederation of Light also held that the state church should stand apart from the politics of the Imperium, providing spiritual succor to the peoples of the galaxy, but not serving as the dominant force in the governance of the Emperor's realm. Such a position was a direct threat to the political power of the Ecclesiarchy, which had become the most powerful component of imperial government, transforming it largely into a theocracy by the end of the 35th millennium. The Confederation proved too difficult for Ministorum agents to infiltrate, and the Ecclesiarchy turned to violence, supported in this effort by the unanimous vote of the High Lords of Terror, who declared the onset of the First War of Faith, largely to ensure that imperial political stability was not damaged by the emergence of religious plurality and possible religious violence between different sects. The entire Confederation was declared heretical, and the forces of the Astra Militarum, the Navis Imperialis, and thousands of fanatical zealots from the Church's Frateris militia were unleashed upon it, bent on its destruction. Only a few cells and hidden shrines of the Confederation managed to survive, and the power of the Orthodox Ecclesiarchy over the minds of humanity, for better or worse, was made unassailable. By the end of the 33rd millennium, every civilized imperial world was furnished with its own cathedral, and the coffers of the Ecclesiarchy were filled with the offerings and tithes from the teeming billions of the God Emperor's faithful. This wealth was squandered in building increasing numbers of larger and more lavish cathedrals, and to fund more wars of faith, intended not to save the souls of humanity, but to secure the Ecclesiarchy's position of political power within the Imperium and the wealth of its prelates. The Age of Apostasy. In the 36th millennium was one of the most destabilizing periods in imperial history after the Horus Heresy, beginning during the long struggle between the Ecclesiarchy and the Administratum for ultimate political power over the Imperium. The High Lord Goge Vandir, the 361st Master of the Administratum, was a power-hungry tyrant who eventually gained direct control over the Ecclesiarchy as well as the Administratum by usurping the office of the Ecclesiarch. This made him the single most powerful individual in the Imperium since the Great Crusade, and allowed him to place his own rule above that of the Emperor. His time in power became known as the Reign of Blood, consisting of massive purges of the Ecclesiarchy and the killings and assassinations of countless perceived traitors, heretics, and conspirators. This period was eventually ended by the future Ecclesiarch Sebastian Thor's reborn Confederation of Light, an ancient sect of the imperial cult based on the previous Confederation of Light's banned teachings that sought to end Goge Vandir's corruption of imperial theology. The end of the Reign of Blood resulted in a major reformation of the Ecclesiarchy, the creation of the Imperial Inquisition's Ordo Hereticus, to police those enemies of the Imperium who lay within its own structures, and the creation of the Adeptus Sororitas, to serve as both the Ecclesiarchy's new military forces and the chamber militant of the Ordo Hereticus. The Plague of Unbelief is considered to be a part of the Age of Apostasy by imperial historians, although it occurred several solar decades after Sebastian Thor's ascension to the position of Ecclesiarch and subsequent reform of the Adeptus Ministorum along the theological lines of the Confederation of Light. The main perpetrator of the Plague of Unbelief was the traitorous apostate Cardinal Bucaris, who for a time controlled vast swaths of the Imperium under his heretical rule until he was finally brought to the Emperor's justice by the Space Wolves Space Marines and a betrayal by his own enraged people. The Imperium of Man is pervaded and dominated by religious faith. It is unsurprising that the Ecclesiarchy often bristles at the presumption of other imperial organizations, taking easy offense to slights to its position and pride. As many in the Adeptus Ministorum see themselves as the keepers of the faith that unites humanity, they often stray into the presumption of a divine right of authority that extends further than that of other imperial organizations. Chief amongst those who come into open and occasionally bloody conflict with the Ministorum's more fanatical members are the tech priests of Mars, and more rarely the space marines of the Adeptus Astartes, most of whom deny the divinity of the Emperor, preferring to uphold the original, more secular traditions of the Imperium. The openly deviant faith of both these organizations has nagged at the suspicions of the pious for millennia. Some in their pride and zeal feel that it is their right and duty to see the faith of these bodies brought into line and bound to the authority of the Ministorum. Often the result is disastrous, as both the Astartes and the Mechanicus are fiercely independent and wield great powers of their own. More subtly, the Ministorum constantly flexes its secular influence over the Adeptus Terra to varying degrees. Certainly in the past, certain cardinals and prelates have gone so far as to use blackmail, assassination, and even full-blown civil conflict to enact what they consider the Emperor's holy design. However, any who would see the return to domination of an all-powerful state cult like the Temple of the Savior Emperor must also fear the Ordo Hereticus and its answer to such hubris and presumption. Heresy from the faith is not simply a matter of mutation, witchery, and trafficking with warp powers. More subtly, it can be a matter of the specifics of faith and worship. The cult imperialis is broad in its accommodation of differing tones of faith. However, on the fringe lurk numerous sects and groups who flirt with heresy and deviate from the Imperial Creed to such a degree that their faith is no longer sanctified. The worst cases are declared as abomination by the Ministorum's authorities. The boundary between sanctified faith and heresy is thin, and many sects cross it simply because the ruling center of the Ecclesiarchy shifts and leaves them suddenly no longer accommodated within the official Orthodox theology of the cult imperialis. Countless times over the past 10 millennia, the Ministorum has gone to war with a part of itself over a point of dogma. The Imperial Creed is the body of doctrines and articles of faith in the God Emperor, which is preached across the Imperium. It is the word of the Emperor as related by his saints, and it forms the core of belief shared by every worshipper across the length and breadth of the Imperium, regardless of the form of worship practiced on the world of their birth. In practice, the Imperial Creed operates on several levels. In the rarefied atmospheres of the Holy Synod and the Synod Ministra, the cardinals debate endlessly the minutiae of the words of the saints. Arguments about the exact meaning of a particular phrase might rage for solar decades, even standard centuries, causing bitter schisms amongst the various factions as the prelates decry one another as benighted fools, dangerous reformers, or even heretics. Indeed, there have been many occasions when outright violence has erupted between factions holding opposing views on such interpretations, and in the most extreme of cases, the cardinals of neighboring dioceses have mustered vast armies from the ranks of their congregations and made war upon their erstwhile brothers in faith. Every solar day, the synods disseminate reams of pronouncements and clarifications of learned texts and annotations of existing ones. The cardinals are expected to preach such tracts to those below them, thus propagating the true word across the Imperium. In practice, no one person can be conversant in such a vast body of doctrine, and huge armies of scholars are employed to identify the relevant passages for their masters and to file the remainder away in the vast archive shrines of the Ministorum. The second level on which the Imperial Creed operates is at the opposite end of the scale, in the soul of every human being in the Imperium. The vast majority of the faithful exist amidst unending toil and oppression, where the only alternative to a life of abject servitude is to be shipped out to a faraway war to be slain at the hands of some bloodthirsty alien monstrosity. For many, the act of worship is the only brief respite they have from the brutal reality of day-to-day life in the Imperium, an opportunity to escape the cruelty of their overseers before returning once more to their bitter labors. Of course, those who tarry overlong before the altar are wont to be punished harshly, and many have been condemned to service in the convict armies of the penal legions for returning from the shrine a mere solar minute past their allotted time. Nevertheless, reverence of the Emperor as the divine savior of mankind is the one thing shared by people across the Imperium. Only those ensnared by the dark gods themselves or enthralled to some manner of alien domination reject the Emperor. A person might be the very worst kind of scum, a rebel, a pirate, or a slaver of flesh, rejecting all the laws of the Imperium, yet still they will hold true to their belief in the God Emperor of mankind. The Imperial Creed is a conglomeration of native religious practices, the modifications to those practices imposed by the missionaries, and the myriad pronouncements passed down from the Adeptus Ministorum's upper echelons. As such, practices adhered to on one world as sacred may be held as abhorrent on another, depending on its own combination of native, modified, and imported belief. The Ministorum tolerates a vast range of practice and belief, but there are certain tenets of faith which remain unchanged from one end of the Imperium to the other. At the core of the Imperial Creed are the facts that the Emperor once walked among humanity in the flesh and that he is a god. Furthermore, regardless of whatever powers may have been worshipped by humanity prior to the coming of the Emperor, he is the one, true God, and no others may be worshipped alongside him. So long as these essential tenets are adhered to, the prevalent faith on any given world can exhibit staggering diversity. Almost every world has its legends regarding the birth of the Emperor and his early life. Amongst the oldest of sources claim the Emperor was some manner of shaman, born on old Earth, long before the rise of human civilization, who watched and guided mankind's development throughout countless eons until taking a direct hand at the dawn of the Age of the Imperium. Other myths claim the Emperor was any one of 1,000 different legendary figures, or in fact all of them, moving amongst mankind in disguise and preparing for the time when he would be called upon to save his people. Even the officially sanctioned texts disseminated by the Ministorum vary greatly on such matters, and each tends to present the views of a particular saint, invariably couched in layer upon layer of allegory. On most matters, no single objective truth is actually presented, but rather a vast body of parables on which those who preach the creed can draw in order to impart almost any message they choose. One constant element is the notion that every human being has a place within the Emperor's divine order, as expressed through the hierarchy of the Ministorum. For the vast majority, that place is at the bottom, following unquestioningly the orders and duties passed down by those higher up. Even those of status and rank must comport themselves as if power and wealth were burdens rather than privileges. There can be no questioning of official orders, for to do so marks one out as a heretic, as surely as if one had blasphemed against the Emperor or summoned a demon in the midst of a cardinal's sermon. Aside from these central tenets, there exists a massive body of imperial religious dogma, both sanctioned and unsanctioned. Much of it is the subject of debate at the very highest of levels, while some may be prevalent for long periods before receding in relevance once more, or may be preached fervently in particular regions but barely mentioned in others. A recurring theme of imperial cult doctrine is the notion of the end times. Most writings on the subject take the form of prophecies, but they rarely have much in common other than dire prophecies of a galaxy-spanning war consuming mankind. Throughout the 10,000 years of the Age of the Imperium, such notions have gained prominence towards the end of each millennium, often becoming self-fulfilling, as the masses whip themselves into a pre-apocalyptic frenzy. It is often preached that the end times will form the ultimate battle, in which mankind will either be found wanting and destroyed, or will prove itself worthy of existence and enter a new age, where it will inherit the galaxy and expel or defeat all other intelligent forms of life. Needless to say, as the 41st millennium is defined by the catastrophe of the Great Rift's birth in the era Indomitus, the Imperium has seen a rise in such teachings and in adherence to apocalyptic cults. With the Imperium nearing its 10,000th year, the turbulence might well be expected to be far more destructive than ever before. Often tied into the notion of the end times is a belief that the Emperor will rise from his golden throne and complete the work he began 10,000 years ago by delivering the faithful from the evils of the galaxy. While many versions of this doctrine celebrate it as a time of deliverance, most also warn that the Emperor will sit in judgment over all humanity, casting those lacking in faith into infernal fire, or otherwise excluding them from the glorious age that will be ushered in by his final victory over evil. Cults dedicated to flagellation and penance seek to prepare mankind for the return of the Emperor, driving themselves to ever greater extremes to prove themselves free of the taint of sin. Many ecclesiarchy teachings mention some form of afterlife in which the faithful will take their place at the side of the Emperor for all eternity. As with so many elements of the Imperial Creed, the synods have debated the specifics of this afterlife for millennia, while the common person has remained generally influenced less by the cardinal's pronouncements and more by the specifics of their own culture's beliefs concerning death and the afterlife. For those worlds on the very extremes of the Imperium, cut off from the centers of power by vast gulfs of interstellar space or by raging warp storms, Terra itself might be imagined as the eternal court of the God Emperor, to which the faithful are called when they die. Others imagine this afterlife in more abstract terms, teaching that the soul after death will be taken to a golden realm, there to mingle with those who have gone before in the light of the Emperor. Given that many worlds experienced a long period of isolation during which all manner of barbarous religious expression developed, there are perhaps as many ideas of paradise and the afterlife as there are planets in the Imperium. Of course, those who believe in divine reward must also believe in punishment. If only those who have been judged worthy will be allowed to bathe in the Emperor's glory, then those who have not must surely be damned. It is often the case that the Ecclesiarchy's preachers spend far more time warning their congregations what will befall their eternal soul if they stray from his path than they do describing what awaits it if they are virtuous. Such warnings are laden with almost wanton descriptions of an eternity of damnation, of gibbering fiends tormenting the sinner's soul while it writhes in infernal flames. Those few like Psykers who know something of the reality of the warp have all the more reason to be fearful, for within the Empyrean, the souls of humanity drift as motes upon an ocean, ever at the mercy of the vast, unknowable things that lurk in the depths and feed upon forlorn souls. Imperial saints are those mortals who, by pronouncement of the Ecclesiarchy, have been elevated by the Emperor's grace far above the bulk of humanity. They are exceptionally holy individuals, and their words and deeds are held to be the direct work of the Emperor himself. Throughout the 10,000 Terran years of the Age of the Imperium, millions of men and women have been recognized as saints, in many cases long after their death, and only after solar decades of consideration by the Church. Most are known and venerated only within a specific region, but some, such as Sebastian Thor himself, are known across the length and breadth of the Imperium. Men and women might be declared saints for all manner of deeds, but in most cases, they will have performed some great service to the Imperium and the Imperial Creed. In a galaxy riven by war, it should be little surprise that many were great warriors, often the leaders of massive imperial crusades that conquered vast swaths of space or liberated human worlds enslaved by aliens or recidivists. Many were generals or admirals, while others were simple foot soldiers who, by doing their duty, turned the tide of battle and changed history. Other saints were great teachers or orators, men or women who, with a single word or missive, could achieve what 1,000,000 imperial guardsmen could not. The writers of the most learned of religious tracts are often made saints, lending even greater weight to teachings preached across countless planets. Furthermore, it is common practice for ecclesiarchs to be declared saints after their deaths, although the beatification of less well-respected or beloved individuals may take solar decades or even centuries to come about. Many saints are regarded as intercessors, to whom prayers are addressed and offerings made, that they might aid the faithful in some manner. It is held that the saint, being human but also close to the God-Emperor, might be able to petition the Emperor and bring about some tangible effect. Many saints come to be regarded as able to intercede on specific issues, such as to provide deliverance from aliens, safe passage across the warp, a successful crop, or a warrior's true aim. Given that such a vast pantheon of saints exists, the matters on which they are said to be able to intercede are often extremely specialized. Some regiments of the Astra Militarum, for example, hold that there is a specific saint for every single one of the thousands of marks of standard issue lasgun. A common and often problematic issue for the Imperial Creed is the question of Psykers. There exists at the heart of Imperial doctrine a contradiction with regards to those blessed with the Psyker's gift or cursed by its touch, depending on one's standpoint. Every Terran year, more and more Psykers are born or come into their powers, and the danger they pose to humanity cannot be understated. Psykers draw the denizens of the warp to them like blood spilled in the ocean draws sharks, and those who are weak or unprotected by the right of soul binding to the Emperor can unleash fearsome devastation upon their communities. Some might be consumed by evil impulses and simultaneously find themselves gifted with the power to kill with merely a glance. Others might find their minds turned into gateways to the infernal regions of the Empyrean, through which entire legions of demons may vomit forth. Psykers, therefore, are often said to represent the single most dangerous peril to the very soul of mankind. At the same time, the Imperium could not exist without Psykers. Without astropaths, the scattered worlds of the galaxy-spanning empire could only communicate at the slowest of speeds. Without navigators, interstellar travel across great distances would be impossible, and without the sacrifice of millions of Psykers every year, the blessed light of the Emperor's Astronomicon would not be able to guide them through the benighted depths of the warp. In addition, the many arms of the Imperium's military use Psykers as potent battlefield weapons, including the librarians of the Adeptus Astartes and the Psykers primaries of the Astra Militarum. Furthermore, although most would not think of him as such, the Emperor himself was the most powerful Psyker to have ever lived. Many of the teachings of the Imperial Creed preach against Psykers, who are often referred to and condemned as witches. In truth, although most amongst the faithful feel a deep unease in the presence of astropaths and other sanctioned Psykers, reality dictates that Psykers are part of the grand plan the Emperor has laid out for humanity. It is the Psyker who is not sanctioned, who hides amongst the faithful and uses their powers for ill, who is the true target of the Ministorum's ire. And few sermons pass without the congregation being called upon to be ever vigilant for such a threat within their own ranks. Because of the diversity of opinions within the Imperial Creed, the line between orthodoxy and heresy is often blurred. Obviously, worshipping any other god than the God-Emperor is forbidden, and those who overtly turn from the Imperial Creed are punished by death, as are those who deny the authority of the Adeptus Ministorum. While those who turn to the worship of forbidden gods, such as the ruinous powers or alien overlords, are the most obvious of heretics, many other beliefs have been declared heretical throughout the ages. What does and does not count as heresy is generally determined by the high officers of the Ecclesiarchy. Massive divisions of the Adeptus Ministorum exist to monitor and study the myriad sects that exist across the Imperium. Highly ranked, free-roaming priests with equal status to a cardinal seek out and destroy the taint of heresy. These witch-finders often become the scourges of entire sectors. Of course, many of the Imperium's worlds are scattered and isolated, so a sect may gain prominence on a given world and flourish for many standard years before a cardinal or witch-finder arrives from off-world and decries it as heretical. What happens next will depend upon the character of the officer. Some may convene courts of assize, sitting in judgment over those accused of heresy. Others are more wont to summarily execute sect leaders and instigate a worldwide program of religious re-education to purge the taint of errant doctrine. The most extreme, such as the notorious witchfinder Tannenberg, put entire worlds to the pyre on the merest suspicion of heresy. The accusation of heresy in the Imperium is often used as a political weapon by those wishing to gain power over others. This can occur at multiple levels. A reasoned debate between brother cardinals can be brought to an immediate end should one of the two hint at accusing the other of heresy. A diocese that has proven tardy in the raising of tithes can be brought into line by the merest hint of the word. An accusation of heresy is a blunt tool and one that can turn upon its wielder, for those accused might have previously unknown allies or patrons, and outright war between rival factions sometimes results. There are several variant faiths within the Imperium which the Ecclesiarchy has no choice but to tolerate, even though it disagrees fundamentally with their tenets. The cults of the Adeptus Astartes are such faiths. Every Space Marine chapter is faithful to the Emperor and its own Primarch, but they do not usually revere the Emperor as a god. Rather, to them, he is a man, albeit the greatest who ever lived. This breaks with the single most important tenet of the Imperial Creed and has on many occasions proved a source of great tension and even overt hostility between the two organizations. On the whole, however, the Adeptus Ministorum and the Adeptus Astartes try to maintain cordial relations, for the Space Marines are the literal genetic descendants of the Emperor through the blood of the Primarchs, which flows in their own veins 10,000 Terran years after the entombment of the Master of Mankind. The cult Mechanicus is another deviant faith with which the Ecclesiarchy is often at odds. The tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus worship their own deity, who they call the Machine God. As with the Imperial Creed, many sects exist within the cult Mechanicus, and it is commonly held by the priesthood of Mars that the Emperor is in fact a physical manifestation of the Machine God as the long-prophesied Omnissiah, although many in the Ecclesiarchy have great difficulty accepting this. Other sects appear to outsiders to be saturated in idolatry, worshipping the very machines they are tasked with maintaining and committing 1,000 other transgressions, punishable by death by the laws of the Adeptus Ministorum. Despite such differences, the Ecclesiarchy has no choice but to tolerate the cult Mechanicus, for without the tech priests, the Imperium would literally grind to a halt. No institution can do without the Adeptus Mechanicus, just as none forego the services of the Adeptus Astra Telepathica or the Navigator houses, regardless of how distasteful they might find their servants. Many of the Imperial Creed's teachings warn of the danger of mutation. It is often said that the Emperor created mankind in his own perfect form, and that any deviation from the physical norms of the human body is an indication of inner impurities and sins. Some would say this doctrine is quite correct, for it has long been known that where instances of mutation increase within a population, there will soon follow a rise in Psyker birth rates. Some blame mutation on spiritual corruption, alien intervention, or chemical pollution. Mutation tends to take one of two forms. The first is spontaneous and can occur anywhere, at birth or later in life. There is often no discernible cause, and the afflicted may go to great lengths to hide their mutation. If the mutation can be hidden, the individual might be able to lead a relatively normal life. But if it is so obvious that it cannot be hidden, the mutant may be forced to flee from their community and seek others similarly afflicted to start a new life. Many worlds are subject to strict laws regarding mutations, and these may be policed by purity patrols, which conduct arbitrary raids on workplaces and homes and stop-search operations in the streets in order to identify mutants. Only those with the power or wealth to avoid or pay off such scrutiny have any chance of avoiding it, and many of the Imperium's most influential noble houses are the subjects of vicious rumors regarding the genetic horrors they are believed to regularly spawn. The second form of mutation is that which, throughout the ages, has become stabilized and, to a degree at least, recognized and tolerated. Such mutants are commonly referred to as abhumans. Some populations are tall and muscular, some squat and stout. Over the millennia, these characteristics have become so exaggerated that new strains of the human genome have become established, often encouraged by genetic tinkering of one sort or another. It is not uncommon for explorers operating at the fringes of the Imperium to discover human populations lost since time immemorial who have developed some unusual physical trait. Through deliberate selection on the part of the society in question, such characteristics might become ubiquitous in the population. These might include garish skin coloring and patterning, exaggerated or even additional limbs, or the ability to see in the dark, breathe underwater, or any one of thousands of unusual features that might be considered mutation. The fate of many such strains is to be annihilated at the hands of vengeful Puritans, but often a small number of survivors are spirited away by curious inquisitors, tech priests, or others for further study. Attitudes to mutation vary widely across the Imperium. On some worlds, no divergence whatsoever is tolerated, and even stable abhuman strains such as ogrins might be shot on sight. Others harbor vast mutant underclasses, often condemned to a life of servile drudgery doing the jobs that no others will undertake. It should not be assumed that civilization denotes enlightenment in this matter, or that ignorant feral worlders are more or less likely to be more accepting of mutation than educated nobility. Superstition rules at every level of the Imperium, from the High Lords of Terror right down to the lowest indentured menial. The attitudes of mutants themselves towards the Imperial Creed can be just as varied, depending upon the degree to which they are allowed access to it. Preachers often flock to worlds where a large mutant population is tolerated, sometimes as punishment from their superiors, but other times because they genuinely wish to make a difference in the Abhumans' lives. Such sermons often take the form of lengthy diatribes, telling the mutants that they are filthy and debased, that they are fortunate to be allowed to exist at all, and that their continued existence can only be justified by their toil. In the case of abhuman populations who are useful to the Imperium, such as ogrins or ratlings serving with the Astra Militarum, they may be exposed to a highly simplified version of the Imperial Creed, extolling the virtues of service and reward, but leaving out more complex or problematic doctrines. In fact, it has been noted that the childlike mind of an ogrin can be easily inspired to great acts of bravery by the admonitions of a skilled preacher, and the commissars of the Officio Prefectus are especially adept in rousing their charges to such ends. If the Imperial Creed preaches that human mutants are filthy and debased, then the alien is entirely beyond the pale. The vast majority of mankind is kept in deliberate ignorance of the literal existence of aliens, although they are often used as allegorical bogeymen with whom the faithful must have no contact. On more isolated or frontier worlds, the realities of life make some contact with alien races inevitable, for example, when the aliens are the only source of certain necessary resources. Some distant colonies actually share their worlds with native aliens, and species such as the Kroot occasionally serve as imperial mercenaries. On the whole, however, such contact is frowned upon and openly decried by roaming confessors and preachers. There are some alien species with which any form of contact whatsoever is utterly forbidden, except at the point of a gun. While most of these species would just as soon eat or enslave mankind in turn, others are noted for their propensity to manipulate and exploit weak-minded fools who seek some advantage in dealing with them. These include, amongst many others, such vile creatures as the sloth, the crave, and the reek, contact with whom has spelled the doom of many an errant human merchant and adventurer. When the enemies of the Emperor descend upon his worlds, the symbols of mankind's faith are often the target of the invader's rage. Even before a world has fallen, terrible blasphemies are enacted upon the majestic cathedrals, and officers of the imperial faith are often subjected to horrific tortures as a warning against further resistance. When an imperial world falls to the followers of the dark gods, its bastions of faith are bedecked with the defiled corpses of its priests, their once graceful facades daubed in unspeakable blasphemy, and the statues of its saints are toppled. Quite apart from such overt iconoclasm, changes in the fabric of a cathedral or shrine have often proved to be an indicator of subversive doctrine. Imperial witchfinders are adept at discerning subtle changes in iconography that might indicate that a local sect of the Imperial Creed has been infiltrated by outside agents or fallen prey to the rot of heresy. Sometimes, symbols from pre-imperial religions are placed over those of the Imperial Creed, or the features of statues changed to represent not the saints of the Imperium, but darker prophets. For instance, on the world of Sabulorb, a statue of the Emperor was given additional limbs by the alien-dominated priesthood, while on Feng's world, the authorities of House Varkon are ever vigilant for the early signs of yet another apostate cult festering within the dismal hives. The Ecclesiarchy is not officially part of the Adeptus Terra, but is organized as a wholly separate imperial adepta. At its head is the leader of the imperial cult, the high priest known as the Ecclesiarch, who by tradition since the 32nd millennium is always one of the Imperium's ruling high lords of terror. Below him are the cardinals, of which there are several thousand, each of whom oversees the Ecclesiarchy's operations and properties in a diocese comprising a sector, subsector, or even a single world of imperial space. Below the cardinals are the priests known as pontifices, confessors, missionaries, and preachers in that order. The clerical orders of the Ecclesiarchy are open to men and women alike, though men seem to have an advantage in achieving high position because many believe that as men, they are closer to the perfection of the God Emperor, whose perfect embodied form was that of a human male. The Adeptus Ministorum's own governing body is the Holy Synod, a conclave composed of the Ecclesiarchy's most powerful archcardinals and cardinals. The Ministorum divides the Imperium's territory across the galaxy into thousands of dioceses, each generally encompassing an entire imperial world, the exception being Terra, the heart of the Imperium, which possesses several dioceses because of its sheer population size and political importance. Some dioceses can encompass several worlds or even an entire sector in the case of the officials granted the extremely powerful rank of Cardinal Astra. A diocese is further divided into parishes centered around a shrine or church. Each diocese is headed by a cardinal, while each parish is headed by an imperial priest with the title of preacher. Ranking between these individuals are priests known as pontifices, whose authority extends over several parishes to serve as administrative go-betweens in large dioceses between preachers and their ruling cardinal. Priests known as missionaries have no administrative duties within a single diocese, but can be deployed to spread the faith of the imperial cult to newly rediscovered human-settled worlds. They are always part of the Ecclesiarchy's missionary wing that is called the Missionarius Galaxia. Confessors are evangelical zealots who possess a rank within the Ecclesiarchy somewhere between preacher and cardinal. Their oratory skill can stir the emotions of entire worlds, leading them to confess personal heresies and mutations and to betray their neighbors as psychers, heretics, mutants, or other deviants. They are free to wander within an entire diocese and preach amongst the population. They often work on imperial colonies and are especially useful on worlds where faith is lacking and the people are rebellious against the Imperium. With special dispensation from the Ecclesiarchy, they may even gather armies of Frateris militia or the Sisters of Battle and lead wars of faith against the enemies of the Imperium. Confessors often wear the Rosarius as both protection and a symbol of their rank. The Adeptus Ministorum also includes an administrative bureaucracy headed by priests called archdeacons who control all secular business within the Ecclesiarchy. Archdeacons are the administrative counterparts to cardinals, responsible for the temporal affairs of an entire diocese. The archdeacon's subordinates, known as deacons, deal with the money entering and leaving a specific diocese or parish, regulate the construction of new shrines and temples, and deal with the other secular requirements of running a galaxy-spanning religion. The Ecclesiarch is the high priest of the imperial cult and is based in a fortress within the ecclesiarchical palace on Terra. Elected by the Adeptus Ministorum's ruling Holy Synod of Archcardinals, the Ecclesiarch's main concerns include the pursuit of the Ministorum's interests in the Senatorum Imperialis, the preparation and launch of new imperial crusades and wars of faith, and ensuring the continued religious devotion of the imperial citizenry. The Ecclesiarch has held a position as a ruling High Lord of Terra since the mid-32 and millennium, and is always one of the most influential voices on the Senatorum Imperialis. The Archcardinal is the official who stands at the top of the Ministorum's hierarchy, leading a sector synod, which is more often than not more of an idea or principle than a rigid structure or chain of command. Though an Archcardinal is the head of the sector synod and commands, or at least has substantial influence over, each of the dioceses in the sector, the true power of the Ministorum rests in the hands of the individual diocesan synods, often known by the world, or location on that world, where that diocese's cardinal resides. Central to the Ministorum's power within a sector of imperial space are the dioceses, the demesnes of the faith, each of which is under the command of the cardinals of the sector synod. Some dioceses can encompass more than one world or even an entire sector in the case of the church officials granted the extremely powerful rank of Cardinal Astra. This division allows the Ministorum detailed control over the sub-regions within a sector, as well as giving individual worlds or specific problems direct attention. Each cardinal of the sector synod is a powerful individual in his or her own right, having risen to their lofty position through standard years of sacrifice, devotion to the God Emperor, and most importantly, cunning and relentless politicking. Each cardinal maintains their own diocese on the world on which they reside, more commonly referred to as their seat of power, the center of the cardinal's authority and base of operations within their archdiocese, from which they rarely, if ever, leave. A pontifex, pluralis pontifices, is a priest who ranks between the ruling cardinal and the parish preachers of a diocese, and whose authority extends over several parishes to serve as administrative go-betweens in large dioceses between the needs of the local preachers and the administrative apparatus of their ruling cardinal. An archdeacon is a senior ministorum priest who is subordinate to a cardinal and helps to oversee the daily functions and duties of the Creed temporal. This branch of the Ecclesiarchy oversees the astronomical wealth flowing into its treasuries, wealth which is rendered by the faithful as their right and proper offering to the imperial cult in the service of their soul's salvation. It is the archdeacon's duty to administer to the logistics of the diocese, coordinating the construction and maintenance of its cathedrals, as well as countless other institutions such as shrine worlds, pilgrimage sites, reliquaries, and retreats. Each archdeacon is responsible for the distribution of as much wealth as an imperial sector governor or the patriarch of a wealthy interstellar merchant concern, and they are often the subjects of bitter jealousy from such secular lords of the imperium. A deacon, also called a dean, is an intermediate rank of ministorum priest, tasked with secular duties for their sector. Below the archdeacons are those ministorum priests known as deacons and deans, who are responsible for the distribution of the resources passed down to them from the sector synod, as well as the actual collection of dues from the faithful. Firebrands are groups of fanatical zealot priests of the ministorum. Groups of zealots and militant preachers often serve an important purpose in rooting out heresy. Cells of these fiery individuals pray and recite litanies together, often during combat. These firebrands must be handled with care by whatever controlling entity, be it Ecclesiarchy or Inquisition, puts them in the field, as firebrands are just as likely to report the existence of a heretical enclave as they are to incinerate the city block where the enclave is meeting. A drill abbot is a member of the ministorum and a decorated veteran of the Imperium's wars who works tirelessly at converting the orphans of martyred imperial servants into driven and dedicated fanatics prepared for the trials of imperial life. Drill abbots run the Schola's Progenium, brutally effective institutions which every Terran year produce untold numbers of future planetary governors, commissars, adeptus arbites, arbitrators, navis imperialis officers, stormtroopers, and inquisitors. Confessors are free-roaming zealots of the imperial cult who use their evangelical platform to agitate the crowds of imperial citizenry that turn up to hear them. Under the spell of an arch-confessor, swaths of citizens will rush forwards to confess their personal heresies, reveal their hideous mutations, and betray their comrades as psychers or other untrustworthy deviants. A confessor might have administrative responsibility for a hive city, or, if it is less populated, an entire world, or in frontier regions, an entire star system, or even a subsector. Just as not every imperial cardinal heads a diocese, not all confessors are responsible for a specific geographic area. Many act autonomously, their duties taking them far and wide across a given region of the Imperium. Some find themselves attached to other imperial institutions and adepta. Often, an Astra Militarum general or Navis Imperialis admiral might have as their most trusted confidant a senior confessor who advises them on spiritual matters and bolsters their resolve to enact the Emperor's will. A preacher is the lowest-ranking ordained member of the imperial clergy within the Ecclesiarchy. They are known as the Defenders of the Faith. Often individual regiments of the Astra Militarum and vessels of the Navis Imperialis are accompanied by dozens of preachers, many of whom regard it as their duty to personally take the field of battle and provide religious inspiration to those in their care. A preacher is also the rank of ministorum priest, who is given a parish of their own to run, which is centered on an imperial shrine or church. A preacher is the priest of the imperial cult, who will have the most day-to-day contact with ordinary lay worshippers of the emperor. Especially vigorous and charismatic preachers may be lucky enough to be promoted to become confessors.
Heresy grows from idleness. Keep the civilians busy working and the heretics away from the minds of the faithful. Ensure their thoughts are consumed with dedications to the God Emperor's glory and nothing else. If their zeal starts to waver, encourage it with punishments.
This quote exemplifies the Ministorum's harsh stance against any deviation from the Imperial Creed. Their methods of enforcing adherence through work, indoctrination, and punishment of any perceived heresy or lack of faith embodies their uncompromising nature. Such ruthless zeal defines the Adeptus Ministorum's approach to maintaining what they view as the one true faith of the Imperium. In conclusion, the Adeptus Ministorum is a powerful and quite controversial force in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. As fervent upholders of the Imperial Creed, they play a key role in maintaining humanity's spiritual and ideological unity against myriad foes. However, their intolerance of other cultures and religions, as well as the fact that they can be used as an instrument of political control, draws much criticism. Nonetheless, the Adeptus Ministorum remains an integral part of the Imperium, and its influence on events in this grim and unforgiving universe cannot be underestimated.